Why are some countries rich and others poor? I mean, it sounds like an easy question, but nothing could be further from the truth here. In fact, the origin of wealth is one of the key issues, if not the most important issue, in political debates.
There are 3.5 million more women living in poverty today than when the president took office. We don't have to live like this.
I want to give middle-class families and folks who are striving to get in the middle class some relief.
Are the poor countries poor because there are rich countries? Do the richest countries have any special geographical characteristics that determine their success? Are natural resources the source of wealth? Are their inhabitants smarter? Or, most importantly of all, is there some limited amount of wealth that we simply have to distribute?
Porque esa insultante opulencia al lado de la más intolerable miseria es indecente, es indigno.
Well, dear viewer, if the answer to all of those questions was yes, then we could say that our luck is set and we simply can't change it. If we're rich, great, and if we're poor, apparently there are only two paths. Either we quit or we put our trust in some sort of messianic leader who promises us some kind of revolution. Of course, these revolutions, well, they almost always end up making things much worse.
Nosotros no queremos ser rico. Ser rico es malo.
But just hold on a moment here, because I actually think that this approach is missing something. Well, honestly, I think it's missing rather a lot of things. Obviously, folks, many factors determine whether a country is rich or whether it is poor. And in this video, we're going to focus on one of the factors. In fact, probably one of the most important issues of all. And we'll do so by taking a look at the history of the entire American continent. So listen up.
America versus America.
America. One continent, two very different realities. Some countries are very rich and others very poor. For example, check out Canada's per capita income. Even taking price difference into account, it is 5 times that of El Salvador or Ecuador. Then consider the fact that the per capita income in the US is 4 times higher than it is in Colombia. Yes, it's true, and there's also a group of countries that we could describe in relative terms as sort of middle class. We've got Chile and Panama. Their income is 3 times that of Bolivia and almost double that of Peru. However, broadly speaking, of the 1 billion people living in the Americas, approximately 40% live in some of the richest countries in the world, mainly the United States and Canada. Meanwhile, the other 60% of Americans live in countries that are either very poor or are still developing. And of course, faced with this panorama, the question is, why on earth is there such a contrast between the two great North American powers and the rest of the continent? Or even, why are the countries located at both ends of the continent generally richer? Well, just check out this map. The countries that are painted with a darker color are richer. However, it may be easier to notice the enormous difference right on the border that you're seeing. Donald Trump's favorite border, of course, the one between the United States and Mexico. On the north side of the border, we do have the US, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. A country where, in general, its inhabitants are much richer and much safer, and they live longer lives than those on the southern side of the border, those who live in Mexico. In fact, one crosses the border and suddenly everything changes. But why such a difference? Well, because at the end of the day, we're talking about territories that have a very similar population and natural resources. Don't forget that much of California, Texas, and New Mexico, some of these states which, by the way, are the most prosperous and innovative in the United States, were Mexican at the beginning of the 19th century. And the people who manage to cross from south of the border to the north have quite high employment and entrepreneurship rates, so of course we're not talking about racial or religious motives here. But then why on earth does this huge contrast exist between the north and the south of the border? Well, you might be thinking right now that obviously it's because they've had worse governments and worse politicians. But I mean, where did that come from? Did almost all the countries south of the US-Mexico border just simply have this sort of bad luck? Is there not another factor involved? Well, listen up here.
Different destinations.
Dear viewer, to continue in the video today, we really need to take a small trip. We need to go back to the year 1600. Imagine there are two brothers, John and Peter, who are about to embark on the American adventure from some European port. However, due to fate, they end up on different boats. One of the brothers, John, left in search of fortune in Mexico, while Peter got on a ship that was heading farther north to what later became known as New England, and today corresponds to the states of New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, and Rhode Island. And you might be picking up now that this is indeed one of the richest areas in the United States. Now the question is, if you'd been in these two brothers' places, which ship would you have preferred? The one that was going to Mexico or the one that was going to New England, to Boston? Well, dear viewer, for those of you who answered Boston, I think you should rather reconsider your decision. At the time, they couldn't have been more different. You see, John, he arrived in Mexico City, a city full of monuments and new buildings, a city that had nothing to envy from European cities. At that time, Mexico was part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, an area of expansive governance that was full of wonders, cultivated fields, ancient civilization ruins, large cities, etc., etc. But Peter, he arrived in a cold, desolate, and unpopulated area, a place without infrastructure, where mere survival was something of a challenge. It was a place where real hunger and true cold were raging. Actually, the Spanish conquerors didn't move further north because there was no wealth to extract there.
The English chose North America not because it was attractive, but because it was all that was available. The desirable parts of the Americas, where the indigenous population to exploit was plentiful and where the gold and silver mines were located, had already been occupied. The English got the leftovers. Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail.
In New England, one had to work very hard just to survive. In the South, however, they were different. There were many natural riches, the climate was much better for agriculture, and there was a large local population used by the Spanish conquistadors to do endless hours of work in exchange for practically nothing. The fact is that all these resources meant that many of those who arrived didn't have to work in order to survive. And not only that, many of the institutions that existed in old Europe could be easily replicated. These were institutions like the aristocracy and bureaucracy, that is, the officials or the royal favors, which were privileges granted by the state and which benefited only a select few. These included things like commercial monopolies, land distribution, mining exploitation, etc. That way, little by little, on the one hand, a culture was born in which work and entrepreneurship were not perceived as the best way to prosper. Instead, people just needed to make good connections with those who were in power. I mean, why risk investing when you can just hold out your hand for a handout? And then on the other hand, an elite class was formed by people who lived based on the resources that others extracted. They lived through privileges, forced exploitation of the natives, land distribution, concessions, public revenues, taxes, etc. This was an elite class, by the way, which, based on the standards of the time, lived at full speed, which meant having to extract more and more resources from the others. This meant that this elite group that controlled the economic resources not only didn't have to worry about investing, innovating, or taking risks, they actually placed obstacles for other people. And, dear viewer, this culture didn't disappear with independence, it simply remained, consolidating some of the most remarkable characteristics of Latin America. An elite class with a lot of wealth that is based on obtaining rent, overlords, a lot of bureaucracy, and a shattered social elevator. Meanwhile, in the north, things were going completely differently.
The survival.
Unlike what happened in the South, the North had no resources and no indigenous population to exploit, so there was no other option but to work hard, invest, and innovate in order to improve the standard of living. Thus, the social climate and the institutions that were developed were very, very different. Physical, hard work was well regarded. And not only that, since these territories were very poor and practically depopulated, they had a lot of political and economic autonomy. Actually, at first, the British Crown didn't really care much about these colonies. They were more concerned about what was happening in other parts of the empire where things were more lucrative. In fact, it was only when these colonies began to prosper that the Crown started to pay attention to them. This means that the Crown began to establish political and economic controls, as well as introduce taxes. And as we all know, these settlers didn't take that lying down. See, it's often said that the US War of Independence was a fight to obtain freedom. However, many of the incentives that led them to fight had more to do with maintaining the freedom that they were already used to and which they were no longer willing to give up. Hence, once they obtained their independence, they worried a lot about making sure that neither their liberties nor their entrepreneurial capacities were at risk. But some of you might be thinking right now, well, Simon, hold on a minute because you're forgetting about slavery. Well, actually, I'm not, because the slave states, they weren't actually the richest. Slavery enriched a few at the great expense of others. Of course, if instead we talked about two companies instead of two brothers, in the long term, it would have been much better to invest in the one in Boston. The keys to development, they don't lie in the natural resources of a country or in the exploitation of anyone. They lie in ingenuity, entrepreneurial spirit, and in work. That's why when politicians make this process difficult, for example with taxes, a strong state, a lot of bureaucracy, or privileges for their friends, the results, they're always really bad. In a way, it's similar to what happens with the natural resources. They can help, but they aren't enough to generate real wealth. There are very rich countries that hardly have any natural resources, like Japan or Singapore, and others with many resources but are incredibly poor, like Venezuela. Ingenuity, work, and capital are more important than any natural resource. The good news here is that poverty, it's not determined and you can escape it. Trajectories such as those seen in countries like Chile or Panama in recent decades show that things absolutely can change. But now it's your turn. Do you think we'll soon see an economic takeoff in Latin America? Well, leave your answer in the comments below as well as in this survey. And I also really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.